So we'd finished this year of eating local, and one of my friends to celebrate, the day after the last day, brought over her famous peanut butter chocolate chip cookies, which normally I would have been able to eat six of quite happily. I took a bite of one and I had a full-on sugar rush. And
Mm.
I thought, oh my gosh, like, isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting how our insulin levels adjust for our sugar? But I thought, wow, like, isn't it interesting how my insulin levels before were adjusting for so much sugar and now with so little? Like, just a bite of a cookie is like I ate a tub of ice cream.
So, welcome to this episode of At the Helm, the health podcast where we explore food as medicine. I'm your host, Charles Helm, and my very special guest today is Dr. Suzanne Crocker, a retired family physician and an award-winning documentary filmmaker who lives in Dawson City in the Yukon Territory, somewhere around 300 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. And after working for almost 20 years as a family doc in Dawson City, she retired from medical practice to spend more time with her family and soon discovered filmmaking. Her first documentary was entitled All the Time in the World. And in this, she took her physician husband and her young family of three kids off grid into a remote Yukon cabin for 9 months. Now, this film won the most popular Canadian documentary award at the 2014 Vancouver International Film Festival. And then her second film, which we'll be focusing on more today, is called First We Eat. And that film documents an entire year in which Dr. Crocker and her family, at this stage, teenage kids, and maybe a little bit initially reluctant, I think that's fair to say, but anyway, for a whole year, they only consumed food. And here are the criteria: it had to be grown, gathered, hunted, or fished around Dawson City. A sustainable diet. Obviously, this was not easy. And this beautifully shot film depicts the gritty, challenging, and the hard scrabble reality of that diet. This film was one of the winners of the Audience Award at the 2020 Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival. We'll focus on that today. So I'd just like to say I am hosting this from the traditional territory of the Treaty 8 First Nations in what is today known as Tumbler Ridge in the northeastern corner of British Columbia in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It's my privilege to do that. May I call you Suzanne, Dr. Crocker?
Please, please.
Thank you. So you're so welcome. We're delighted to have you. Welcome to At the Helm.
Thank you. And I'm speaking to you from the traditional and contemporary territory of the Tronde-Chin in Dawson City in the Yukon.
Wonderful. So Dawson City in the Yukon. I'd like to just give a little bit of context for that for our viewers. Many people will know it as the site of the Klondike Gold Rush 1898, when your population was, I think, at its height somewhere around 40,000 or thereabouts, compared with somewhere under maybe 2,000 souls today. And many of us, myself included, have had wonderful times in Dawson City. Often I think people heading up to the Arctic Ocean via the Dempster Highway, they might choose to spend a few days in your wonderful community. And as you've said, this is the traditional territory of the Tronde-Chin First Nation. And if you will forgive me, there's one thing I just have to mention because I'm also a paleontologist. And there's this wonderful discovery in 2022 of a mummified baby woolly mammoth, about 30,000 years old. And as with many of these things, this was discovered by a miner operating a bulldozer, and he hit something and realized this is not usual. And this was this beautiful baby woolly mammoth named Nunchoga and adopted, as I understand it, by the Tronde-Chin First Nation. So it's a lovely story. And I hope that in future years it's adequately celebrated and brought to people's attention. But anyway, that's a sidetrack. I think from our purposes today, Suzanne, I think you've mentioned that your growing season is short but intense, and it sounds like nothing, 66 consecutive frost-free days in a year, but those days are just about continuous sunlight. So it amounts to something. Am I correct?
Yes, you're correct on that. And in the growing season, I often say it's almost as if you can watch things grow day by day. They seem to get bigger. But of course, it's very short. 8 months of our year is winter. So short but intense.
It's a long winter. So Suzanne, you and I are both family docs. I understand you graduated with your MD from Queen's University in 1989. So the obvious question, how did you get from Queen's to working with your husband as a family doc in such a remote northern community as Dawson City? What was it like being a family doc there?
Yeah, it's incredible being a family doctor here. It's a very privileged position to really get to be a doctor in a community where you know everybody. And then of course, as a family physician, you have the privilege of getting to know more about people than you would if you're just their friend or their neighbor. And yeah, so it was a wonderful place to practice. It is a wonderful place to practice. I just retired from it. You definitely have time to spend with people. You're not rushed through. You do everything that you can because all the specialists are 550 kilometers away or more, and so it's a very varied practice. But just yeah, just a real privilege and felt very holistic, I would say, just because you know people as people. One of the first questions we would often ask a new patient is not what's wrong, but how did you come to be in Dawson?
Right. And I think it's that lack, there's no anonymity because you know your patients and they know you, and just like you've said. And that lack of anonymity threatens some of our colleagues, and others like you and I would just lap it up and say, this is fantastic. It's great. But so what made you choose Dawson City?
Well, I did my family practice residency in at Memorial in Newfoundland, and a lot of it was spent outside of St. John's. And I really just wanted to go to a small remote community. I grew up in a small town in Ontario, so I'm not a city person. And yeah, I just really wanted to go somewhere remote. So I looked at the north, and it was kind of, dart on a map. And Yukon was chosen. And I went up to Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon, to locum for a summer and absolutely fell in love with the Yukon as soon as I arrived. I had driven across the country, went up the Inside Passage on the ferry, and yeah, it's such a beautiful part of our country. And then while I was here, I traveled around the Yukon, discovered Dawson, and then fell in love all over again with this community. I found, it was great working in Whitehorse, but it was at that time probably 35,000 people, which was too big for me. So Dawson, I decided I'd just come to Dawson and work for a year, and, never looked back.
Yeah, what an inspired choice, and obviously benefited not just you, but the community as well, and with your husband there as well. And then at some stage, you chose to leave your practice to spend more time with your family and kids. Some interesting parenting choices, if I might say so. You took them offline for 9 months, living in a remote cabin, and you documented that so effectively. And then that led to your second film. And, there's this maxim, this mantra, eat local. I think you took that to an unprecedented level. And in the film, it seems to me that one of the motivating factors for you, one of your concerns, was just this immense long supply chain where food has to be trucked in for thousands of kilometers, huge carbon footprint, I think you said your grocery stores just have 3 to 5 days of supplies, and therefore the vulnerability of a community like Dawson City. Am I correct in that? I'd like you to take me back to that time and place, and what made you think I've got another film in me that I've got to bring to the forefront. And how much planning, how much preparation did it take? So just tell me your story. Yeah.
Yes, well, living in the north, you do realize this vulnerability you have to long supply chains. There are times when the only road into Dawson or into the Yukon has been closed, sometimes by forest fire, sometimes by natural disaster like landslides. And, that was, those were sort of wake-up calls to me to realize that the store wasn't this infinite supply of food, that food also had to come up that highway. And so lots of northern remote communities understand that. Some communities are fly-in only, some are boat-in only, and weather, natural disasters, if something cuts that off, you really feel how vulnerable you are. And at the same time, I was coming to understand that, of course, the Trondikwichin, who've lived here for millennia, ate entirely locally, with no things coming up the highway because there was no highway, and they were just fine. And back in the early 1900s, apparently Dawson was able to provide 97% of its own food. And now we've done a total flip where about 97% of our food gets trucked in from thousands and thousands of kilometers away. So it was a combination of those things that just made me think, okay, like this is a bit crazy that we are so vulnerable in something so important as food. And it's been done in the past that people have been able to eat local or almost 100% local here. So I wondered what it would look like to try and do that in in this decade, in this century. And that was basically the motivation for the experiment. I started to become really interested in issues of food sovereignty and food security and thought rather than researching it academically, the best thing for me to do would just be jump right in and try it, and by trying it, figure out what the choke points would be, what the benefits would be. So that's what I did. And I think that, at the time, I thought, okay, I don't know really if the rest of the country is going to understand this vulnerability that we have up in the north. But then the pandemic happened, and I think everybody across the country, across the globe, started to understand the vulnerability of long supply chains and how important it is to be able to rely on your own community for the essentials in times of crisis.
Yeah, that's so true. I want to come on to the details of what you ate in just a second, but I can't not ask you this. Your husband and your kids, they're such an important part of the film. And that was just so fascinating to watch. It's now 6, 7 years since the experiment, if I can call it that. How do they look back on it now? I can see this either becoming a huge eye-opener, learning moment, or it could induce rebellion amongst teenagers. How did it go?
Well, at first it induced rebellion. The when I brought up this idea, the entire my entire family flatly refused to participate. And it was I'm still not entirely sure how I got my husband on board, but I think it was the intrigue of the possibility that finally brought him on board. And he said he would join me. And then, of course, since our three teenagers weren't doing the grocery shopping, once he was on board, then they sort of just felt had to follow along. But yeah, there was great reluctance at first. And the rule, I mean, as anybody with kids knows, especially teenagers, you can't necessarily tell your kids what they can and can't do. So the rule was no grocery store food inside the house, but outside the house, they could do whatever they wanted. So I would often get comments from folks in the community about them spying my kids in the grocery store and buying this or that. And I do remember I used to make dry meat for their lunches, and I remember hearing that they were trading their dry meat for sandwiches at school, and everybody on both sides of that bargain were happy.
Right. So, Suzanne, I've just got a question, if I may, about weight for you've got five family members, and whether eating sustainably in this fashion had any effect on weight, either going up or going down. And then also three teenage kids. This is a time of growth, and it's a time for, perhaps increased nutrients in your diet. Were there any concerns or any problems either with weight or with for the kids in that growing phase not getting enough?
We did weigh ourselves on a monthly basis, everybody in the family, just to out of curiosity to see what was happening. I'll start with the kids. The kids did not lose weight, and they continued to maintain or gain weight appropriately for their age. My son, who was 17 at the time, was into a working out phase. He was trying to consume 5,000 calories a day. Little did I know what that meant for me, who was trying to provide enough food for him. But yeah, he was still able to do that. So I just had to keep churning out the meat and potatoes, and all was good. For my husband and I, we both did lose weight. My husband most precipitously at the beginning. He lost, I believe it was 15 pounds a month for the first 2 months, so 30 pounds. And I mean, I will say on his behalf, he did have a little bit he could have lost at that time, but it seemed to be related a lot to the carbohydrates. We, at first we had no grains. And eventually, because one of our farmers was able to grow some rye and a tiny bit of wheat, then we had some rye grain. But in those first few months, we had zero grains, and I feel like that was the biggest change. And I know for my husband, he does, whether or not, he's eating grains or not eating grains does really affect his weight. So that was interesting. Our weight stabilized. We didn't, continue to lose weight below anything that was not normal or sustainable. Another interesting thing that happened with the grains when we did finally have this rye grain that we could use to try and make. I tried to make 100% rye sourdough bread with some better success than other. But at the very beginning, when we had this rye grain, I had been craving grains, and so I just cooked the rye grain like I would porridge, and then poured some milk and some birch syrup on it, and just went right to town with this bowl of rye grain, having had none for 3 months. And my guts were totally upset by that, as probably could have been predicted. But and it made me think about, at least in my time as a family physician, when people were worried about food sensitivities affecting their guts and things like gluten, that often we would suggest going off a food, like a grain, for a period of several months, see how you feel, and then reintroduce it and see how you feel. And it just made me think about that and question that advice because I don't have a gluten sensitivity issue, but having gone off it for several months and then reintroduced it, I felt awful. So it made me wonder about the validity of that challenge and that advice that I had given people in the past. So I don't know, but it's food for thought.
But I guess the bottom line, at the end of 12 months, all five of you were pretty close to ideal body weight. I think that's what counts.
Yes, yes, definitely. Nobody was underweight. Those
Yeah.
of us who lost a few pounds, yeah, went down to ideal body weight, I
Ideal
would say.
body weight. Yeah. And I'll
And
just
stayed
add
there.
there, yeah, I'll just say there's no surprise there for me either. I mean, to me, that I'd have been surprised if it was any other way. I'm just thinking of how to categorize the diet that you followed, this sustainable diet. And I think, I mean, it's obviously a modified ancestral diet. I'd imagine you had access to some things that a thousand years ago might not have been there, dairy, for example. But it's probably best, I'm thinking, categorized as a modified paleo diet because it's ancestral stuff, but there's the dairy, which isn't typical paleo. So if I had to slot this in somewhere, it's certainly omnivorous because you ate anything and everything that you could possibly get your hands on, I think. But did you have, as a family doc, did you have any, I mean, macronutrients, I'm sure are fine. I mean, you got enough protein, you got enough fat, you've got a variable amount of carbohydrate, very few simple sugars, but the micronutrients, were there any concerns about the vitamins, the minerals, etc.?
Yeah, I did wonder about that. And for example, vitamin D, living in the north, I take vitamin D supplement throughout the year, but especially in the winter because we don't have much sunlight. And I decided though that I wouldn't take any supplements like vitamin D that year and just see what happened. And like talking to Trondheim elders, there was an idea or a concept when you eat all parts of the animal. Sometimes, like the rabbit would go in the soup pot with its stomach contents still in place, and the rabbit would have been eating from the land. And so there was this idea of a lot of those micronutrients and vitamins coming naturally if you ate all edible parts of the animal. So I wanted to see what would happen. And the vitamin D was really interesting. I mean, I should say I did monitor my blood work before I started this experiment for a year, and then every 3 months, and then at the very end. Um, as expected, my vitamin D level started out fine, but then started to fall below normal in the early part of the winter. And that was when I discovered about burbot liver. So burbot is a bottom feeding fish that we fish for only in the winter. We ice fish for. It's sometimes called not correctly a lingcod, but something similar to a lingcod. And it has a really large liver. I guess it's got the largest liver of any freshwater fish. And in that liver, it's packed full of vitamin D. So this was one of my many, many discoveries during that year. So I thought, okay. So we started eating burbot liver, and if you fry burbot liver, it kind of tastes like scallops. It was very pleasant. And so I looked into it more, and about, I think it's around 10 grams of burbot liver would give you the equivalent of 1,000 units of vitamin D. So I started eating burbot liver, and my vitamin D levels went back to normal again. So it was, yeah, it was just sort of one of those things to say, okay, there are if you know there are places where you can find these things, and even if you didn't know that possibly eating all parts of the animal will benefit you in that way that you wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah, and can I assume that when you say you're frying it in butter that you have made yourself or something like that?
Yeah, I mean there was no oil, of course. So yeah, our fat was butter that I would have made from the cream, or animal fat. So moose fat, uh, pig fat. Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine the cardinal feature of your diet is that there would be zero or minimal amounts of processed food, no highly refined carbohydrates, nothing like that. I mean, it's a modified ancestral diet, so none of that stuff.
Yeah, there was no processed foods at all. I mean, everything was made from scratch. Yeah, so some of the things that I didn't necessarily, well, I knew that I wouldn't be having them, but I didn't necessarily think about them all that much before I started. But like no salt, no oil, no vinegar, no condiments, like some of those kitchen staples that we just get used to having weren't there. So that was also very, very interesting. But it was definitely um, a very I mean, all the protein was animal based because we just don't have the growing season to grow enough legumes or nuts to be significant. One of our great farmers who Grant Dowdell, who's no longer with us, but he farmed on an island up the Yukon River, and he had one of the best micro ecosystems for farming, being on this island in a river. So he could grow things that some of the other farmers couldn't grow as well. So for my year of eating local, he planted a whole bunch of chickpeas, some in his greenhouse, some outside. He was successful in growing some, but here was like the best ecosystem for growing in my area. And at the end, I maybe had 2 cups of chickpeas. So not, not a sustainable protein. Somebody else was successful in growing quinoa, and but we could not figure out a good way to get the saponin coating off the quinoa, so it didn't end up being a staple. Other people have eaten lamb's quarter, which is related to quinoa, and it's grows wild here. I did try eating lamb's quarter grain, but yeah, difficult for for any amount. So and then I thought, okay, well, sunflower seeds, maybe a sunflower seed. So I actually went around town in the fall collecting with permission the sunflower heads from every garden and business that was growing sunflowers around. But again, we just don't have a long enough season. So there are very few that actually had formed seeds. And maybe I got a quarter of a cup of sunflower seeds. So this idea of having sunflower seed oil or sunflower seed butter was non-existent. So it was, that was very interesting to me too, to think that yeah, in this year, all my protein is going to be animal based. And I wondered what the health implications of that would be, because of course there's a lot of promotion of vegetarian and vegan eating. You could not be a vegan and eat local to my community. So then, you have the question, okay, so what will those implications be? But also from my thinking, the broader implications of bringing food from far, far away. That was when I can't talk to the farmers who grow it. I don't know if it's monoculture affecting biodiversity. I don't know how it's grown. You know, that just didn't make as much sense to me in the end as eating what my geography can supply, even if that meant an all animal-based diet.
Yeah, and just in response to that, Suzanne, I mean, this film is beautiful. It is what has been called gritty. I mean, you leave the viewer in no doubt whatsoever how things get from A to B, B being your plate. Um, Nothing appears magically on your plate. It's very clear to the viewers how things get there. Um, I know I met you first and became aware of your work in a climate emergency conference, and there were a few people in the audience, vegetarians, who asked you about this. And, some reviewers have said so this kind of sustainable eating is messy, it's disorderly. But what I'd like to know, yeah, your approach to how to depict, it must have been a choice, how to depict the killing and butchering of game and farm animals and fish and so on. Because this is reality. I guess it's not, nothing is sanitized. That's the way of putting it in the film. You've just told us how it is. So any thoughts on that?
Yes, as part of this eating, made it, I made it necessary to myself that I would be part of the killing of the animals. I mean, I didn't do the killing, but I was there for the killing of the animals. I was involved with the farmers all through 4 seasons. So I was there during the raising of the animals. And what I discovered is that, well, one thing, the farming that's done here is done very humanely, very sustainably. These animals have a good life. There's no factory farms here. It's all small family-run farms. So, they have room. They are doing what animals like to do, whether they're chickens or pigs or cows. And they're treated very well in their lifetime. And at the time of their slaughter, I was surprised that I didn't have a reaction that was, oh, I can't watch this. It felt like the sacrifice of an animal felt like a gift that was feeding me and my family. I felt full of gratitude. I knew the animal had a good life. I was there for the slaughter, so I knew it was done quickly and humanely. And yeah, and it was okay. And I feel like, that's kind of important for those of us who are eating meat to understand that it comes from an animal, to know how that animal is fed and raised and slaughtered, and yeah, that it's not just magically appearing on a styrofoam tray under saran wrap on a grocery store shelf. And yeah, so whether it was the processing of a chicken or a moose or a pig, I was there through the stages, and that felt important.
Yeah. No, that's very precious. And I mean, you sound to me when you express things in that way, like some of the indigenous leaders that I've listened to who have a similar kind of philosophy on that. But if I can just change tack a little bit, I want to ask you about salt because salt is such a big part of the film and whether this was a challenge for you and how it went, because I imagine there's very little natural salt for you to find in the fresh water of the Yukon.
That's right. We're very far from the sea, so that was not an option. Yeah, so I feel like I knew going into this that physiologically I would be okay without added salt because there's naturally enough salt in meat and fish. And I did, as part of my blood work, did check my sodium chloride levels and proved that that was the case. They were totally fine throughout the year. So at first, the lack of salt was mostly a problem from a taste. Everything at the beginning tasted very bland. But then there was this transformation that happened, I would say about 2 to 3 months in, where it sort of felt like your taste buds came alive and I could taste the flavors of things just really intensely. So even things like tomatoes tasted salty, spinach tasted salty, celery is really salty. So after a while, things didn't taste bland anymore. I could taste all these flavors. And so that was no longer an issue. But I thought about salt from a preservation point of view. And it's throughout time has often been used to help preserve food. And so I thought, well, it would be really interesting to know what kind of source we could find, not being close to the sea. So I did some experiments to to try and find an alternate source of salt. And do you want me to go into those, or do you want me to just
Sure.
say
Yeah,
they
just
were
to
odd?
summarize. Yeah, sure.
So there is a wild plant that grows here called coltsfoot that when you taste the plant as a green plant, it just tastes like you're eating a leaf. It tastes like nothing, not particularly salty. But if you dry that leaf and then you burn it, the ash actually tastes salty. So that was fascinating. So I collected and burnt a fair amount of coltsfoot for coltsfoot ash, but when you mix that coltsfoot ash with your food, it it doesn't make your food salty. It really, I don't know what the chemical is, but it has to be the ash on your tongue to get the salty flavor. Anyway, that was kind of interesting. And then I thought, okay, what about mineral licks that animals use? And so some friends knew where a mineral lick was and brought me back a sample of that, which just is basically mud. And then I tried to boil the mud and filter it and distill down to get the salt. And what I got in the end was a very concentrated mud, but it did taste incredibly salty. So that was interesting. And then one of my physician colleagues talked to me about blood, like animal blood. And I mean, in some cultures, the when an animal is slaughtered, the blood is also one of those things that is consumed because it's full of nutrients and iron. And so he said, well, what about what about getting salt from animal blood? Well, he happened to have this great idea at a time when the slaughtering had already happened, so there was no animal blood to be found. So he decided that we should experiment with his blood and see if we could use centrifuge it down, use the serum and evaporate out the salt. And then subsequently I tried with animal blood, and that actually worked. So if, I think my conclusion was that really the best thing to do if one needed salt for preservation would be to trade with somebody who lived by the sea.
Right.
But failing that, if you desperately needed salt for some reason, and I don't know if you could get enough for preserving things, but I think animal blood, making use of the animal blood of the animals that you're already slaughtering would make some sense.
Right. So what you're saying is we're not going to become hyponatremic, low blood serum sodium levels from not eating salt, because we do get some in our diet. But may I ask you what happened to your blood pressure when you're having hardly any salt to eat, if I can?
Well, I wonder before we just go to the blood pressure, if we should talk about iodine.
Yeah, sure. As I understand it, the problems with iodine are, well, firstly, you can get a goiter, which used to be called endemic goiter when more than 10% of a population would have a swelling in their neck from the thyroid. But I mean, that's just a cosmetic thing. But more concerning is, I think, in pregnancy and in the newborn and in growing people, uh, lack of iodine can cause some quite serious problems with mental health and sluggishness and cretinism from in utero iodine deficiency. So there are quite some substantial things here.
I did think about, our table salt is supplemented with iodine. Iodine was one of those things that isn't a standard thing to measure in your blood. So I had to get special permission and I had to pay for that test. So I don't know what my iodine level was before I started. I only checked at the end of the year. But assuming it would have been normal when I started, it was low at the end of the year. And that did not seem surprising to me because I wasn't having any iodized table salt. But I was a little surprised because when I looked for sources of natural iodine, they mostly come from the sea, from creatures of the sea, from seaweed, from kelp, of course, which I don't have access to. But we have all this salmon that that used to, doesn't anymore, but used to come upstream to Dawson. And so I was eating a lot of chum salmon. I think we ate 25 or 35 chum salmon over the winter. And I would have thought that maybe that would have brought enough iodine, but clearly it didn't. So that was interesting. So I guess if I had to do this long term as well as trading with somebody by the sea for salt, I would also maybe have to get some kelp and seaweed to deal
Right.
with iodine.
All part of the trade. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we come back to the blood pressure?
Yes, let's go back to the blood pressure. So I had hypertension, high blood pressure for a few years before I started this eating experiment. And I had tried different things lifestyle wise. I was naturally very active. I wasn't overweight. I wasn't a smoker. I tried going off caffeine. It didn't make any difference. I didn't add salt to my food, but I was buying things from the grocery store, so there was lots of salt just in things that you buy in packages. And that none of those things seemed to make any difference. So I ended up on medication for my high blood pressure. When I started eating locally, I wanted to see what would happen to my blood pressure. So I went off my medication and my blood pressure normalized. And that was really interesting to me. And in fact, so interesting that I've continued to eat mostly local ever since and haven't needed to go back on blood pressure medication. So I've thought about why that would be. I mean, there is no local source of caffeine, so I was off caffeine. But like I said, I'd tried that before and it hadn't made any difference. I thought about the salt issue, of course, because it was much lower salt, and maybe that contributed. But I'm not up with the latest medical research because I'm retired for a while now. But, it did seem near the end of my career that salt being the bad guy wasn't quite as big a deal as we used to think in decades past. I did measure my cholesterol and my triglycerides throughout the year, especially because I was eating this very high red meat animal fat diet. They remain totally normal, which is also an interesting aside. Um, and so another physician colleague of mine, we were talking about it one day, and he said, maybe it's the microbiome. And so that theory that, when you are eating more real natural foods, that your microbiome in your bacteria and your natural bacteria in your gut goes back to a normal state. And I think there's starting to be a lot of research that that is affecting lots of diseases. And so I wonder if that was it. It was just that I
Mhm.
was not eating processed foods. My microbiome went back to normal. Less salt because of no processed foods and no added salt. And yeah, it seemed to have
Yeah.
worked.
Wonderful. I just want to say I'm not surprised at all to know that your lipid profile stayed the same, didn't become adverse at all. But you did mention the absence of caffeine, and I think there are going to be many viewers who will be totally aghast and surprised just at the notion that it's possible to survive for 12 months without coffee. Oh my goodness, especially in southern BC in the lower mainland.
Yeah, I
Um,
wasn't I I wasn't sure that I could survive without caffeine. I wasn't so much a coffee drinker, but I was a major black tea drinker. That was both my comfort food and my crutch, I realized, to get me through the day in those slumps of energy. So yeah, going off caffeine was a big deal. And again, there was that sort of 2 month period, I would say, when it was a bit rough. And I would start to actually have to have afternoon naps. And then what I discovered over the long haul was that I actually had more energy and was less tired off caffeine than on it. And I attribute that, when I think about it, is to without caffeine, I had to go to bed when I was tired. I couldn't stay up extra late knowing that caffeine would get me through the next day. I had to have naps if I needed them. And so basically I was giving my body the sleep that it needed and not artificially stimulating it, and therefore I had more energy. So I've actually stayed off caffeine except for chocolate. That's back. But I've stayed off tea and coffee, like caffeinated tea and coffee ever since. And yeah, and I don't mind. Now my comfort drink is a mug of hot milk.
Hot milk, yeah. So we do not need caffeine. That's the bottom line. But I'm sure you could have Labrador tea, spruce tea, pine tea, all those things. I mean, the subs not caffeine, but the other warm drinks you can enjoy.
Yeah, oh yeah, all kinds of and I could grow herbs and forage for different things like you say. So yeah, all kinds of different tea flavors, herbal tea flavors for sure.
Right. So anyway, we've spoken a bit about blood pressure. We've spoken about the lipid profile, cholesterol profile. I'd like to ask you, given that we've got this epidemic of insulin resistance, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, I'm not sure if you tracked your HbA1c or other numbers as well, but is there anything in your sustainable diet that you think could be exportable to folks with these other problems?
Well, I did track my blood sugar throughout and my hemoglobin A1C, and it remained normal, which was not surprising. So sugar. So how did we get sweetness, I guess, during that year? There was no cane sugar, that's for sure. So our sugar sources, the main one was birch syrup. We don't have maple trees here, but we have birch trees. And and you can collect the sap from birch trees and boil it down to syrup, just like maple, only it's an 80 to 1 instead of a 40 to 51 ratio. And we have a wonderful family that lives in the bush in the Yukon that makes Yukon birch syrup. So I would purchase that by the pailful, and that was our main sweetness. And it's delicious. It has all these wonderful complex flavors. So I've become quite a fan of birch syrup. We also had one of our placer miners in the area also kept bees, and he was actually able to overwinter them that year that we were eating local. So I had some precious honey too as a sweetener. And then the farmer I was talking about, Grant Dowdell, who farmed on the island on the Yukon River, grew some sugar beets for me because I wanted to experiment with sugar beets to see if I could make sugar from sugar beets. And you can. It's a very complicated process where you basically slice up the sugar beets and boil them, and then you evaporate off the liquid that you boiled them in, and you eventually get some sugar, but it's not it's not easy, and so you didn't get a lot from that. So those were our sweeteners. But of course, we were having way less sugar than we normally would have. Again, no processed foods, no junk food, no actual sugar. Um, and what I noticed was at the very end of the year. So we'd finished this year of eating local, and one of my friends to celebrate, the day after the last day, brought over her famous peanut butter chocolate chip cookies, which normally I would have been able to eat six of quite happily. I took a bite of one and I had a full-on sugar rush. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting how our insulin levels adjust for our sugar? But I thought, wow, like, isn't it interesting how my insulin levels before were adjusting for so much sugar and now with so little? Like, just a bite of a cookie is like I ate a tub of ice cream. So that was interesting to me.
It's fascinating, and I mean, I think we see that mirrored also with our indigenous peoples, with type 2 diabetes being at such high levels in many First Nations, as a result probably of the dietary changes of the last few decades. And from all we can gather, historically or prehistorically, it just about didn't exist. So I think it's the same thing that you're talking about here. And it's not that you have no sugar because you enjoyed your birch syrup, but in small amounts. And it's all about that kind of balance. I remember trying to make birch syrup. I just remember boiling and boiling and boiling, and it took forever to get anything that even vaguely resembled a syrup rather than just liquid, the water. Anyway, I just wanted to ask you very quickly, were there any toxic reactions to any of the foods? Your kids get food poisoning, anything like that? I was also thinking about mercury because of eating lots of fish from the lakes. Are there any hazards to this kind of eating that we as a species might have created, for example, with mercury?
Yeah, I did look into that, and I don't have it in the top of my head, but on the firstweeat.ca website under resources, there is the evidence about mercury in fish. And I was worried especially about the burbot liver, but in fish, this is what I'm remembering now as I'm thinking about it, that in fish, it seemed that it wasn't the liver that built up the mercury, it was more the actually flesh of the fish. And there were some studies done on mercury levels of fish in different areas. And of course, it depends which area you're in, which doesn't always correspond to areas of high pollution. Sometimes it's the exact opposite, just because of the way things travel. But when I did look into it, it was for the amount of fish I was eating, it was not going to be a problem
Mm,
for the fish in
right.
my
Yeah.
area. So, but it is a concern for sure. And I think, like sometimes it is the more remote northern communities where a lot of this stuff is building up and because of things that are done far, far away. And I do think about this a lot in my life now that I'm not on a 100% local diet, but I don't like eating sea fish much anymore because I just think about, that whole food chain and working itself up and those things never getting destroyed, and
Mm,
it makes me worry. And so yeah, that is definitely a concern going forwards because of course we're all downstream from
yeah.
something, and everything that we create, whether it's dioxins or from burning things or the mercury, like it's or the plastics and the microplastics, it's not disappearing just because we dump it somewhere out of sight.
Mm.
It's all staying as part of the ecosystem, unfortunately, and therefore working its way back up to us.
Yeah, it's not pretty. It's not pretty. But Suzanne, I want to read you a quote. I'm quoting you, and you wrote this because I just loved it. And it's you wrote, having recently chomped into my first leafy greens after a long Yukon winter, I've discovered that eating seasonally is actually joyous. The appreciation I will soon feel for my first slice of cucumber, the burst of flavor from a ripe cherry tomato exploding in my mouth, and of course, the sweetness and crunch of that first piece of broccoli. These are all worth waiting for. Well, you write very well, I must tell you, but that is just so inspiring to me. And it speaks of kind of what we've lost by just having this constant access to everything all the time. But I look at the list of foods that you could make use of. It's a long list. You had a bounty. I know you've spoken about the weeds that you thought were just weeds. Many of them are actually quite nutritious. You could eat them. And then you had this other, not your quote, but you just said this thing about in the summer we eat above the ground and in the winter we eat below the ground, meaning in the summer it's lots of leafy vegetables that we eat. And in the winter you dive into your root cellar and you get the stuff that you've been preserving there. I've got to tell you, this morning I told my in-laws, my mother-in-law, father-in-law, they're both well into their 80s on a farm in Saskatchewan. They still do the annual garden and harvesting the garden. I told them about that quote, and they said, "Well, of course, that's what we do." You mean you didn't know that? Well, I've learned something now. But you're absolutely right. This is a maxim, this is a mantra, and we've just sort of forgotten that. So I just love you to tell me about the joy of seasonal eating.
Yeah, it is joyful. That was a good quote I wrote back then. It
It
sums it
was.
up very very well. And yeah, and I really appreciated eating seasonally. What I found was in the fall after, and I still find, after a summer full of salads and fresh greens, that what my body starts to crave are root vegetables. And that's, what I eat all winter. And then in the spring, I'm kind of sick of potatoes, and I'm really craving the leafy greens, and that's what comes up, and that's what I eat again. And there is some evidence as far as leafy greens go about the amount of nutrition that is lost within 3 or 5 days from picking. So I started to think, like spinach, for example, and I might have this backwards, but it's something like 75% of the vitamin C and 40 something percent of the folate is lost within 3 to 5 days of picking. So I started to think, okay, like the spinach, the fresh spinach that comes to my grocery store in February, like how much nutrition is left in that? And I had sort of grown up with this idea that eating fresh food was better for you than eating frozen food. But when I thought about something like spinach, I thought, well, wait a minute, if you flash freeze the spinach as soon as it's out of the ground, wouldn't that have more nutrients in it than fresh spinach that has to travel from so far away before it gets to my table? So, it led me, by necessity, I was eating seasonally, but it also forced me to think about some of these questions, to think about food preservation, which was so important, and what things you can preserve and what you can't. But I think when you're eating seasonally, both nutritionally and taste-wise, you're getting the best. I mean, we all know what tomatoes taste like out of season or strawberries taste like out of season. They look beautiful, but it's totally different than a strawberry fresh from the ground or a tomato straight from the vine. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember the time when you could only get mandarin oranges at Christmas. And what a special treat it was to get a mandarin orange in the bottom of your Christmas stocking or during the Christmas season. And I think, because everything is always available at the grocery store, we've lost some of that, we've lost some of that special aspect. And we also have kind of lost that connection with, like, not all foods grow 365 days a year. They have seasons, and that's part of our connection to understanding the growing season of different foods is our connection to the land and the climate. And this is all a bigger conversation that connects us to the land, and when we feel connected to it, we respect it, we want to value it, we want to protect it, and that's critically important.
Yeah, wow, there's such wisdom, Suzanne, in what you're saying here. And in trying to wrap up, I'm just going to ask you, I think you've hinted at this already. It sounds like at the moment you're no longer doing your 100% sustainable, but you're pretty much still there and you're augmenting it with a few things which we accept. Either you're going to trade them with someone at the ocean, or else okay, we're not dependent on that supply chain as much as we were, but a few things can still come in. There's sort of a compromise. Am I correct in thinking that? Because that sounds very, very reasonable to me.
Yeah, and I think now of things like chocolate, avocados, even oil and vinegar and sugar as luxury items. And it's great when I have access to them, but I know that I don't depend on them. And I think that's sort of the crux of it, that if we need our communities to be there for us in times of crisis when things are vulnerable, then we need our communities to be there for us all the time, because you can't just all of a sudden have your community grow things because there's a crisis. And if we understand that our community can grow the things that are essential, and what are essential things versus what are luxuries, then I think that that makes us stronger as communities and stronger as societies. So yeah, I still eat, I would say I still eat 90%
Mm.
local to my community. All of my meat, my eggs, my dairy, my vegetables, my fruit, are all still just from the community. But I do enjoy the luxury of chocolate.
Yeah, no, that's so wise. And I would think if more people were to do that, the incidence of type 2 diabetes and prediabetes would go down because you're not going to be pushing anything in your metabolism to lead to those unfortunate outcomes. So it's very, very inspiring. It's a lovely takeaway message, Suzanne. Thank you. But I want to ask you a final question. And that is, what is next? Can we look forward to another film project? I hope so, but I'd love to know where you are in your journey right now as a filmmaker too.
Yeah, there will be no trilogy as far as the family goes. The the kids have all left home or out doing further studies. I often wonder if their idea, their desire to go to university was to pursue academia or to get away from my camera, but whatever, I'm happy they're all doing what they're doing. So there will be no trilogy on that. But I have made, I've actually already released another film. It's called The Home Team, and it shares stories of new immigrants who moved to Dawson from hot climates and countries of and cities of 6 million people to this tiny frozen corner of the north, often leaving their professional careers and their families behind, and why they're here, and how they've embraced the community and how the community has embraced them. So that's one that's out, and working on another one which will be out in 2026.
Wonderful. Love to hear it. And I look forward to watching all those movies, all those films. Suzanne, Dr. Crocker, thank you so much. It's been absolutely a privilege to speak with you and to learn of your insights. And well done again. Congratulations for not just for surviving the whole year, but for bringing it to the awareness of so many other people. It's really inspiring. I would just like to thank Anne Mullins, our producer, Graham Wheeler, our technical support, our technical guru, the Institute for Personalized Therapeutics Nutrition for sponsoring this podcast series, and the Rural Coordination Center of British Columbia for inspiring me to perform this work. Thank you again, Suzanne, and thank you to everybody for watching this. I hope we can see you again soon.